I had refused every eligible man in the county at least once by the time I turned 24, a fact the whole town had opinions about, usually delivered in the particular unhelpful tone reserved for women assumed to be simply too particular for their own good. I never once refused Thaddeus Lowell, my father's farrier's apprentice, who had worked beside him at our smithy for 6 years because he had never once asked, and I finally cornered him one ordinary afternoon at the forge to find out exactly why, in a conversation that would settle within the space of perhaps 20 minutes, a question the entire county had apparently been quietly wondering about for considerably longer than either Thad or I had properly acknowledged to ourselves. My name is Millie Cartwright, and I had grown up in my father's smithy in the particular unglamorous way daughters of tradesmen generally do, learning to work bellows and shape iron alongside learning to cook and sew, since Big Sam Cartwright had raised me alone after my mother's death when I was young and had never seen any particular reason a daughter couldn't learn a useful trade alongside the more traditional domestic ones. I could remember, as far back as memory properly reached, the particular smell of hot iron and coal smoke that had simply always meant home to me, and I had spent my childhood perched on an overturned bucket near the forge, watching my father work with the same rapt attention other girls apparently gave to needlework or piano lessons, neither of which our modest household had ever properly accommodated. Our smithy was, by the standards of a small frontier county, a genuinely essential and well-regarded operation, the only place for 20 miles capable of proper horseshoeing and wagon repair, which meant that whoever eventually married into our family would, by simple practical necessity, inherit a considerable stake in the county's daily functioning. This particular fact had not escaped the attention of the county's various eligible bachelors over the years, and I want to be honest that I had developed, by my early 20s, a fairly reliable instinct for distinguishing men genuinely interested in me from men genuinely interested in eventually owning a share of a prosperous essential business, an instinct that had cost me considerable patience over the years, but had also, I came to believe, protected me from several considerably poorer matches than the county's collective disapproval of my pickiness ever properly credited me for. If I continued refusing every reasonable proposal that came my way, I stood to become, in the particular unkind arithmetic small towns apply to unmarried women past a certain age, exactly the kind of cautionary example mothers use to warn their daughters against excessive pickiness, a fate I found considerably less troubling than the alternative of marrying a man I did not actually want, simply to satisfy the county's collective sense of proper order. I had heard, more than once, some variation of the particular warning that a woman who refused too many good offers eventually found herself with none at all, delivered usually by well-meaning matrons at church socials who seemed genuinely puzzled that I didn't share their evident alarm at my continued unmarried state. What I had not properly examined, until Gareth Higgins's third proposal that particular October, was why exactly none of the county's eligible men had ever struck me as worth accepting, when the answer, once I finally looked at it directly, had been quietly working the forge bellows beside my father for 6 entire years. Gareth Higgins, the local merchant's son, proposed to me that October for the third time in as many years, arriving at our smithy in his fine impractical coat, with a bouquet of flowers that had clearly traveled some distance to survive the trip, and delivering, with the particular rehearsed confidence of a man who believed persistence itself constituted romantic merit, essentially the same proposal he'd offered twice before, with minor variations in the specific compliments paid to my complexion and my father's evident prosperity. "Millie," he said, presenting the wilted bouquet with a flourish entirely unsuited to the practical soot-covered surroundings of our smithy floor. "I've given this considerable further thought since my last proposal, and I remain entirely convinced that our union would benefit us both handsomely. My father's mercantile continues to prosper, as I'm certain you're aware, and a woman of your particular practical capabilities would find herself considerably well suited to managing a proper household of some standing, rather than continuing this rather more strenuous work at your father's forge." "I don't believe my answer has changed since the last 2 occasions, Gareth," I said, wiping forge soot from my hands with a rag rather than accepting his flowers directly. "I appreciate the persistence, genuinely, but I don't believe repetition improves an offer that wasn't quite right the first time." "Every woman says no a few times before she says yes," Gareth said, with the particular confident obliviousness I had come to associate specifically with him. "It's practically expected, Millie. I don't take it personally. My own mother refused my father 4 times before finally accepting, and they've managed a perfectly reasonable marriage since." "I'd rather you did take it personally," I said, "since I mean it personally each time I say it, and I want to record that Gareth left that afternoon in the particular huffy disappointment of a man who had never once considered that a woman's repeated refusal might reflect her actual settled preference, rather than some elaborate courtship ritual requiring additional persistence. I found Thad at the forge shortly after Gareth's departure. working a piece of iron with the particular careful concentration he brought to everything. Sleeves rolled against the heat, and I stood watching him a long moment before the question I'd apparently been quietly carrying for considerably longer than that single afternoon finally worked its way to the surface. There was something in the particular unhurried rhythm of his hammer strikes, steady and practiced in a way that seemed entirely unlike the performed confidence Gareth had just brought through our door, that I found myself noticing with an attention I hadn't properly examined before that particular afternoon, though I suspected, standing there, that I had been noticing it in some quieter fashion for considerably longer than I'd consciously admitted to myself. "Thad," I said, "can I ask you something that's been on my mind rather insistently these past several minutes, though I suspect it's actually been building considerably longer than that?" He looked up from the anvil, hazel eyes carrying their particular habit of not quite meeting mine for more than a moment at a time. "Course," he said, setting the piece of iron aside but keeping his hammer loosely in hand, the particular posture of a man who generally felt more comfortable with a tool in his grip than without one. "Every eligible man in this county has proposed to me at least once these past several years," I said. "Gareth Higgins 3 times, if we're counting precisely, which I am, since he insists on it. You've worked beside my father 6 years, Thad, closer to this family in daily practice than half the men who've actually proposed, and you've never once asked. I'd like to understand why." I watched something considerable happen behind Thad's careful eyes in that moment, a kind of visible internal scrambling that told me plainly this was a question he had spent years hoping never to be asked directly, precisely because directness required an answer he'd clearly never properly rehearsed. His hand tightened slightly around the hammer's handle, the particular reflexive grip of a man reaching for something familiar to steady himself against an unfamiliar conversation. "I don't rightly know how to answer that," he said, setting down his hammer with more care than the action strictly required, the particular careful deliberateness of a man buying himself time. "I'd settle for whatever honest answer you can manage," I said, rather than a carefully constructed one. "I've had enough carefully constructed proposals these past several years to last me considerably longer than I care to count, and I find I'd rather hear something true and awkward than something polished and hollow." Thad was quiet a long moment, and I watched him do the particular difficult work of a man attempting, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, to say something he'd spent considerable years successfully avoiding saying at all. "I grew up with considerably less than most men who've asked you," he said finally. "My father drank away what modest holding we had before I was old enough to properly remember it, and I came to your father's smithy at 17 with nothing but a willingness to work and no particular prospects beyond what I could earn with my own 2 hands. I've watched you turn down men with land and money and proper family names, Millie, and I understood, watching that whatever you were looking for, it apparently wasn't those particular things. But I never let myself believe it might be something I actually had to offer instead, because the alternative, asking and being refused, same as all the rest, seemed considerably worse than simply never asking at all and getting to keep whatever quiet hope I'd built up in the meantime." He paused, looking down at his own soot-stained hands for a moment before continuing, and I understood, watching him, that this particular confession was costing him a considerable effort of will to complete, rather than abandon partway through. I told myself, for the first year or two, that it was simply too soon, that I needed to properly establish myself before I could reasonably ask anything of a woman with your particular prospects. Then a year or two became 3, and I'd convinced myself the moment had passed entirely, that asking now would only invite the particular awkwardness of a man who'd waited too long and lost whatever narrow chance he might have once had. I want you to understand it wasn't indifference, Millie. It was, if I'm honest with both of us, simple cowardice dressed up as patience. He looked up briefly, then away again, the particular habit I'd noticed for years without properly understanding its source. Your father gave me a chance nobody else in this county was inclined to give a 17-year-old with a drunk for a father, and nothing to his name. I didn't want to risk that arrangement, or your friendship, or simply the daily privilege of working alongside you, on a question I fully expected would end with me having to find work somewhere else entirely, once you'd properly refused me, and things turned appropriately awkward between us. I want to record that I stood at that forge considerably longer than the moment strictly required, quietly absorbing the particular weight of 6 years' worth of careful, deliberate silence, finally given proper shape and explanation. You've been standing beside me for 6 years, I said slowly, closer to my daily life than any man who's actually asked, and you talked yourself out of asking because you assumed the answer would be no, based on nothing but watching me refuse men who weren't actually anything like you. When you put it that directly, Thad said, I recognize it sounds considerably more foolish than it felt at the time. It does sound considerably foolish, I agreed, though I want to record that I said it with more warmth than the words alone might suggest. I've refused every proposal these 6 years, Thad, because none of those men were you, though I confess I hadn't properly examined that particular truth myself until just this afternoon, watching you work that iron with the same careful attention you bring to absolutely everything, including, apparently, 6 years of talking yourself out of a question that mattered considerably more than you gave yourself credit for. I want to be honest that saying this plainly required its own particular courage, since I had spent considerable years myself avoiding examining exactly why no proposal had ever felt right, preferring the simpler explanation that I was simply particular by nature, rather than confronting the possibility that I had been quietly comparing every suitor, without fully realizing it, against a man who had never once put himself forward as a candidate for comparison at all. Thad set down his tools entirely now, turning to face me properly for what I realized was perhaps the first time in 6 years that he'd held my gaze without looking away within a few seconds. "Are you telling me," he said carefully, "that if I asked you now, considerably later than I probably should have managed it, the answer might actually be yes?" "I'm telling you," I said, "that I'd consider it a particular kind of injustice if, having finally worked up the nerve to discuss the matter this thoroughly, you didn't actually ask the question properly." Thad wiped his hands on his scorched apron with the particular careful deliberateness of a man determined not to fumble a moment he'd apparently rehearsed, in some private corner of his mind, for considerably longer than he'd ever admitted aloud. "Millie Cartwright," he said, "I've loved you for the better part of 6 years, quietly enough that I nearly convinced myself it didn't count as loving you at all, and I'm asking you now, later than I should have and considerably more nervous than I'd prefer to admit, whether you'd do me the honor of marrying me." "Yes," I said, without any of the careful deliberation I'd applied to every previous proposal, since this particular answer required none. "Obviously yes, Thad. I believe I've just spent the better part of this conversation explaining precisely why." He looked at me a long moment, as though checking whether he'd properly heard the answer he'd apparently spent 6 years assuming was impossible, and something in his careful, guarded face finally relaxed entirely. The particular full, unguarded expression I'd rarely if ever seen from him in 6 years of daily acquaintance. "I don't quite know what to do with myself," he admitted, having finally asked the question I've been avoiding for 6 years and received an answer I'd genuinely stopped allowing myself to hope for. I'd rehearsed considerably more elaborate speeches than the one I actually managed, somewhere in the quiet privacy of my own thoughts over these 6 years, and I find I've apparently forgotten every carefully constructed word of them the moment it actually mattered. "I'd suggest," I said, "that you might start by actually kissing me, since we've apparently established the considerably more difficult verbal portion of this exchange already, and I've waited quite long enough for the rest of it." My father, who I later learned had been watching this entire exchange from the smithy's back doorway, with the particular satisfied patience of a man who had hoped for exactly this outcome for considerably longer than either Thad or I had properly acknowledged to each other, chose that moment to announce his presence with a loud, deliberately unsubtle clearing of his throat. "About time," Big Sam said, with the particular dry satisfaction of a father whose patience had finally been rewarded. "I'll confess I've been watching you two dance around this particular conclusion for the better part of 3 years now, and I'd nearly resigned myself to dying of old age before either of you managed to say the thing plainly. I'd started planning, some months back, on simply locking the two of you in the tool shed together until you sorted it out properly. Though your mother, rest her, would have told me that was considerably too heavy-handed an approach for a father to take with his own daughter's romantic prospects. "You could have simply said something, Papa," I said, laughing despite myself, wiping at my eyes with the back of one soot-smudged hand, rather than watching us both suffer through 3 years of unnecessary uncertainty while you stood back amused by the whole proceeding. "I could have," Big Sam agreed, entirely unrepentant, "but I've found, in 56 years of living, that people generally need to arrive at these particular conclusions themselves, in their own time, however maddeningly slow that time occasionally proves to be. I simply made certain Thad's wages stayed generous enough that money couldn't reasonably serve as his excuse, and left the rest to the two of you. We were married that same winter, in a small ceremony at the smithy itself, since Thad had insisted, with the particular quiet sentiment I'd come to understand was simply how he expressed the things that mattered most to him, that the forge where 6 years of unspoken devotion had finally found its proper words deserved to witness the wedding itself. My father cleared out the working space as best the season allowed, and our small congregation of guests stood among the familiar tools and half-finished ironwork while the forge itself burned steadily behind us, providing, Thad insisted, considerably more genuine warmth than any properly decorated church could have managed on such a cold winter afternoon. Several of the county's women who had once whispered about my particular pickiness attended that ceremony with visible curiosity, and I overheard more than one of them remark, afterward, that they finally understood what precisely I'd apparently been waiting for all along. Though I noted they seemed somewhat less certain how to properly explain that understanding to their own daughters, given how thoroughly it contradicted the conventional wisdom about accepting reasonable offers promptly. Gareth Higgins attended the ceremony with what I understood to be genuine, if slightly bewildered, good grace, remarking to another guest, within my hearing, that he supposed he understood now why persistence alone had never quite managed to win my favor, since apparently what I'd actually been waiting for wasn't persistence at all, but simply a man honest enough to admit what he actually felt once he finally found the nerve to say it. I want to record that Gareth eventually married a considerably more receptive young woman from the neighboring county within the following year, and by all accounts managed a perfectly contented marriage once he'd properly redirected his persistent attentions towards someone actually inclined to appreciate them. A development I found myself genuinely pleased to hear about, since I'd never harbored any particular ill will toward Gareth beyond simple disinterest in his specific proposal. Thad took over the smithy's daily operations alongside my father in the years that followed, eventually inheriting the business outright when Big Sam's hands grew too stiff for the heavier forge work, and I found myself, in the particular satisfying rhythm of those years, working alongside my husband in very nearly the same daily capacity I'd once worked alongside my father, shaping iron and shoeing horses in a partnership that suited us both considerably better, I came to understand, than any of the more conventional arrangements I'd spent 6 years quietly declining. My father lived to see 2 grandchildren born into that same smithy and spent his final working years contentedly supervising from a stool near the forge, offering advice neither Thad nor I always strictly needed but always appreciated regardless, and never once missing an opportunity to remind visitors that he'd personally recognized Thad's quality years before either of us had properly admitted it to ourselves. I still keep, in a small box on our own mantel, the scorched leather apron Thad was wearing the afternoon he finally asked me properly, worn through eventually by years of continued forge work but never quite thrown away. And some evenings, watching him work that same forge with our own children occasionally underfoot learning the trade same as I once did, I understand more clearly each year that the truest kind of devotion sometimes spends considerable years working quietly beside you before it finds the particular nerve to finally say so out loud. My father passed peacefully some years later, having lived long enough to see the smithy passed properly into capable hands and to hold each of our children in turn. And I found, in the particular grief that followed, a considerable comfort in the fact that the business he'd built and the family he'd hoped for had both, in their own ways, found exactly the continuation he'd always wanted, without either of us ever having needed to say so plainly while he was still there to hear it, since some things, I came to understand, are simply better shown through years of quiet daily practice than announced in any single conversation, however meaningful that conversation might have been. The whole county attended his funeral, a testament, I believe, to exactly how essential and how genuinely respected his particular trade and his particular character had become over decades of honest work.